with flow state.
So, Steven, welcome to the show.
It's good to be with you.
So really looking forward to our conversation. As we've just heard, you are a real expert in the field of all things human performance related. And we're going to be talking about a lot of different things in relation to your area of expertise in flow and technology, which obviously I know is a big interest of yours. But for people that may be unfamiliar with the term flow or flow state, what is it?
So you may know flow by a lot of other names. You may call it being in the zone or runner's high. If you play basketball, it's being unconscious. If you're a stand-up comic, it's the forever box. If you're a beatnik jazz musician, you are in the pocket. The lingo is endless. Flow is a technical term. It's a scientific term. It is defined as an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. More specifically, it's any of those moments of rapt attention and total absorption. We get so focused on the task at hand, so focused on what you're doing that everything else just starts to disappear. Your sense of self-consciousness, that voice in your head, the inner critic is going to get really quiet, diminish. Time's going to dilate, which is a fancy way of saying passes strangely. Usually what happens is we just get so sucked into what we're doing that 5 hours go by in like 5 minutes. Occasionally we'll go in the other direction, time will slow down, and we'll get a freeze frame effect. I mean, anyone's been in a car crash. And throughout, all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, go through the roof. And when I say all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, go through the roof, that's not actually hyperbole. A lot of research has gone into what is flow good for. There's 30 years of data on this, 40 years of data on this. And I'll just run through some of it. Lots of people have done this work. I'll try to refer to some of them, but there's 1,000 different flow researchers in the world today alone. So grit, productivity, and motivation skyrocket. McKinsey, the business consultancy, they did a 10-year study. They went around the world and talked to top executives. How much more productive do you think you are in flow? So this is self-reported. So you get like little grain of salt here, but on average, the CEOs reported being 500% more productive in flow. That's a huge, huge number. And normally if you hear a number like that, you should be dubious. Yet that number is in line with all the other numbers we get from other aspects. So the Department of Defense in the United States looked at accelerated learning and flow. They looked at soldiers in flow. They found they learned 240 to 500% faster than normal. My lab, worked on at Harvard, worked on at the University of Sydney in Australia, worked on all over the place, finds that creativity and all aspects of creative problem solving and innovation will amplify 400 to 700%. Meaning, purpose, overall life satisfaction, and well-being are foundationally baked into flow. The people who score off the charts for overall life satisfaction and well-being, these are the people with the most flow in their lives. So there's a really kind of basic health and happiness level to this. There's also a shared cooperative version of flow. It's called group flow. It's just like a team performing at their very best. And so we also see all the stuff that underpins group peak performance. So collaboration goes up, cooperation goes up, communication, empathy, and ecological awareness, which is our ability to see and perceive the natural world. So all these are, I'm just staying on the cognitive side. There's a physical boost too. We can talk about why one state of consciousness amplifies all this stuff. We'll get back to that. But you asked me, what is flow good for? And how are people familiar with it? That's what flow is. That's what it's good for. The final thing I want to say on this topic is really flow is ubiquitous in humans. It shows up, actually ubiquitous in all mammals. So most mammals can get into flow. All humans can get into flow. Anybody listening to me can drop into flow. That much, but the state itself, and this is really important to kind of recognizing it, is it's not a singular experience, right? It's a spectrum of experiences. It's like any emotion, anger. You're a little irked or you're homicidally murderous. It's the same emotion, right? So you can be in a state of microflow with some of flow's core characteristics show up. So you've got complete focus on the task at hand, perhaps an action awareness is starting to emerge. And maybe you don't notice time passing, but that's about it. That's like you go to work to sit down to write a quickie email, you get so sucked in that it like an hour goes by and you look up and you've written an essay. And maybe like bodily, your whole sense of self didn't disappear, but bodily awareness sure did, because when you pop back in your head, you're like, oh, wow, I got to run to the bathroom, right? I got to pee. That happens to all of us all the time. That's microflow. The other end of the spectrum was macro flow. This often, for the first 50 years, scientists thought this was a mystical experience common to religious people or spiritual people. It was only Abraham Maslow actually found flow in a giant study group of atheists back in the 50s. And so suddenly we were like, oh, wow, he was looking at high achievers, and the only commonality his group had was they all didn't believe in God, and they'd all found ways to alter their consciousness and use flow to improve performance. Those were the only two commonalities he could find. But that was the end of mystical experiences. Suddenly flow states were the new term.
It's really interesting. I mean, that all of that is very interesting, and we're going to delve into lots of elements of this, but particularly you talking about the group stuff there. It was in what, because I've read lots of your books, because there's lots of them, everything from sort of Art of the Impossible, the new one, Rise of Superman, Still in Fire. This was the one that I've read most recently with Peter, I know your good friend Peter Diamandis, Future's Faster Than You Think, Bold, Abundance, there's loads of them. But in one of them, and you'll have to forgive me, I don't remember which one it was, there was a study on Navy SEALs operating as a group, and like how they can, I don't know what the technical term was that you used, but it's almost like they're so in flow together that when they're doing these missions,
whenever you get really high functioning teams, you're seeing flow. The extreme example is the Navy SEALs, because they perform in environments where if you're not performing optimally, if you're not in flow, you're probably going to get killed. So it costs about $3 million to train a Navy SEAL. About $1 million of that is spent on skills acquisition and like and physical fitness, right? The rest of it is really spent sort of trying to train them to drop into group flow together.
Wow.
You have one of the things that's the really big deal is, so flow is a radical shift in kind of our neurobiology, and you get a bunch of performance enhancing neurochemicals that show up in the state. And what they do is they sort of amplify information processing in the brain. So we take in more information per second, we find faster connections between it and older ideas and other information, and we're quicker to act upon it. And that's essentially what group behavior is. You're like trying to move as a team. You need really heightened pattern recognition and amplified information processing. And it's got to be very subtle and nonverbal. And the SEALs are very, very good at this, because all of these things, pattern recognition goes up in flow, attention soars in flow, and so forth. So everything you need gets amplified. So they spend a great deal of time trying to train the group to drop into flow together, because it allows them to do their job. But it's anytime you see high functioning teams, this could be on an athletic field, this could be in a boardroom, and you're like during a brainstorming session, right? It doesn't matter. Whenever you're seeing groups of people performing at their best, physically or mentally, you're seeing people in flow.
I can definitely. So I'm one of the few British people you've ever met that play ice hockey, and obviously hockey is huge. You are right. In the States.
I am one of the few. You are.
I'll maybe take the claim as the first there. So
and you have all your teeth, or you appear to have all your teeth, which is surprising.
Just about, yeah, exactly. I've had a nose rebuilt and a few other things, but it's all good. And but there's teammates of mine when I've been on the ice, and I just thought, like, you're seeing the forwards and you're thinking, how the hell are they doing that? They're so connected, and this isn't stuff that's just been trained, but it makes sense for it to be operating in that sporting sense. But it's very interesting. The thing that I want to touch on really quickly, so I have a lot of high performers from the world of personal development that I have on the show, and the thing that I always find fascinating, Steven, is how they ended up doing it. And you've got a real, because you started off as a journalist, right? And in a particular, I suppose, what back then was a very niche sector. I mean, with the particular sector having just been in the Olympics, and on certain elements which have been in the Olympics, makes it quite interesting. So I'd love for you to share briefly with the listeners so we can get to it.
Yeah, this is where this work started for me. I was a journalist in the early 1990s, and journalism, especially then, because it was there was this huge, magazines were the internet before there was the internet, and money was pouring into magazines in the 90s. And so for a brief window of time, if you were good with words, you could get paid to write about whatever you were into and whatever you were curious about. I was super curious about two things. human behavior fascinated me. And I felt that psychology, however useful it might be, it's metaphor. It's not mechanism. And I wanted to understand human behavior, like why we do things at a mechanistic level. And that was what was happening in the 90s in neurobiology and neuroscience. Behavioral neuroscience was becoming a real field. So for the first time, we started to understand, oh, this is where emotions come from in the brain, and this is how they work, and this is why we behave, like all that stuff. Fascinating to me. And so I was doing a lot of neuroscience work. Simultaneously, as you mentioned, I was covering action sports, surfing, skiing, snowboarding, rock climbing, and the like. And if you know anything about action sports in the 1990s, first of all, as you pointed out, they were just like, forget about an Olympic sport. These were like deep subcultures, right? Ski bums and surf bums, and we were freaks and weirdos. And, suddenly the X Games happened and the Gravity Games happened, and everybody kind of was really interested in this stuff. And I was living, in these communities and friends with these athletes and running around with them and writing stories about them. And if you know anything about action sports in the 90s, and this is across the board in all the sports, there was nearly exponential growth in ultimate human performance. So that's the upper edge of performance, right? And we'd never, more, to put it bluntly, more impossible things, like things that people really, like, this has never been done. This is never going to be done. The human body is not capable of doing this. It's crazy. They weren't just being done. They were being iterated upon again and again and again, and over and over and over and over. The level of performance was going up and up and up. And this alone was fascinating. It didn't make any sense. Nothing like this had ever happened in the history of sport before. We'd never seen this much unprecedented kind of assault on what the limits of human performance. But what was really weird about it, what really caught my attention, is these were my friends. You know what I mean? I was in these communities, and all the people who were doing this stuff, everybody I knew, they had fucked up childhoods, broken homes, really bad stuff going on. They had, not a lot of them had great education, right? There was very little money. Everybody was really poor. There was a lot of kind of drugs and alcohol and risk taking, high risk behavior. And normally you put that shit together in a community, everybody dies young or goes to jail. Like, that's what happens, right? What doesn't happen is these people reinvent what's possible for the human species. And that's what was going on. So my initial question was, how is this possible? Where is it coming from? Why is it happening? And then I took this question, it wasn't just the action sport athletes. I was like, okay, so that's what they're doing. And they sort of solved it a little bit there. I was like, I want to know if this is the same in business, it's the same in science and technology. And so I took this question of what does it take to achieve the impossible into every domain. And that's what most of the books are about, right? Tomorrowland examines those kind of maverick innovators who took sci-fi ideas, robotics, bionics, artificial intelligence, stuff that was total fantasy in the 20th century. And then they turned it into actual technology. They turned sci-fi ideas into sci-fi technology in the 21st century. They did the impossible, dreaming up the future. Business, I looked at like Elon Musk, Larry Page, Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, people who had built impossible business empires in record time, and often in places nobody even thought you could build businesses, and so forth. In Abundance, another book I wrote with Peter Diamandis, right? We were looking at small teams of kind of innovators who were tackling grand global challenges like poverty or water scarcity or energy shortages. And this was stuff that 20 years earlier, like large corporations and big governments were failing. And suddenly small teams of individuals were pulling this stuff off, and what the hell was going on? And you could talk about a lot of stuff. And there's, what I saw, but every time I saw the impossible become possible, I saw people figuring out how to alter their consciousness and drop into flow. That's what I was seeing. That was at the heart of everything. There's more going on. When you talk about peak human performance, flow is not the end all be all. There's more you need to do, but it's at the dead center, because it is literally, we're all biologically hardwired for it, and it's optimal performance. So you don't get impossible feats, high, hard goals, huge success without flow. That's how we're built to work. And that's sort of what I discovered. And I wasn't the only one who kind of noticed this. A whole lot of people started to notice this over the same period of time.
Yeah, I mean, what a fascinating way to come across this, which has now become like your life's work, right, for the last however many decades. what your most recent book, the Art of the Impossible, for people that have read Rise of Superman, they've read Stealing Fire, what is it that sort of, I suppose, your updated research that's new?
There's two or three things that are totally different about Art of Impossible. And on a certain level, now that the Art of Impossible exists, you may want to start there, right? It's not that it's a summation of things, but it's the first time I have written how to. It's a playbook. So here, let's give you a little bit of a couple of big picture ideas, and then we'll talk about what this playbook is. First big idea you need to know is that peak performance, whatever we call peak performance, is nothing more or less than getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. It's nothing fancier than just flow is a part of that biology, but the full suite is actually, there's a bunch of skills that we file under the heading of motivation. This is intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, grit, goal setting. That's all motivation. Similarly, there's a bunch of learning skills, creativity skills, and finally flow skills. And the way to think about these quartet of skills, this is the full suite of cognitive peak performance tools. Whenever you face a challenge, motivation gets us into the game. Learning allows us to keep on playing. Creativity, especially when you're going after high, hard, sort of impossible, I don't quite know how to get there goals. Creativity is how we steer. And flow, which is optimal performance, is how we amplify the results sort of beyond our normal expectations. That's the full suite of cognitive tools in peak performance. What's new, what's different, and what's at the heart of Art of Impossible is over the past 4 or 5 years, there's been kind of a new level, like a step function in change in just how we think about human performance. We've all heard about there are books and talks and endless amounts of material about the pieces, the components, grit, books on grit. There's books on motivation. There's books on goal setting. There's books on how to accelerate learning and skill acquisition and, 7 habits, blah, 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 blah. We've got all the parts. What we started to realize in the past 5 years, because the neurobiology has started to become decoded, is, oh crap, it's all one system. It's designed to work together. It's designed to work in an order. And if you can use the system in the way it's been designed by evolution, that we're all hardwired for, you just go so much farther, so much faster, with a lot less fuss. Pardon the alliteration, but that's really what it is, right? It's huge amounts of variation. So when we talk about peak performance, that's what we're talking about. That's the big deal. And what's new in Art of Impossible is we have the full sequence, and I turned all of it into a playbook. This is the order. This is the sequence. This is how to bring. This is what the science tells us about how to do this and bring all of it online, which is cool because we haven't had that before. That's neat.
So is it fair to say that then the art of the impossible is almost really the science of the impossible now, in that you've sort of replicated it?
I always say, what I always tell people is, look, here's what's great about the science. The problem in like peak performance and coaching and all this whole world for a very long time is the standard modus operandi is figure out what works for you and teach it to other people. Right? That's what everybody's been doing. And the problem is what the science shows. That we have a rule at the Flow Research Collective, personality doesn't scale, biology scales. And what I mean by that is your personality is partially nature, partially nurture, and it's really sort of locked into place. And certain things about how I would train you in peak performance, like where are you on the introversion to extroversion scale, or what's your risk tolerances? These things are sort of set up by early childhood. You can change them, but slowly over over a decade. There's nothing quick you can do with hardwired traits. So what works for you, because of these personality things, is not going to work for me. It's almost guaranteed. It's a disaster, right? You need to go one level down to the neurobiology. All mammals are hardwired for flow. This is how mammals perform at their best, right? Like that sort of stuff. When you get it to that level, that's mechanism, that's neurobiology, that's reliable, repeatable. It sort of works for everyone. That is sort of what we've now got, right? And that's, I think, what makes it really cool, because it's no longer, trust me, it worked for me.
Yeah.
If it was trust me, it worked for me, I would have been done a long time ago. You know what I mean? Okay, cool, great.
which is I'm so glad you've said what you just said there. So I originally was sort of schooled in NLP and went deep into NLP, and obviously a big part of NLP is modeling, right? And people go, well, I'm just going to model what they're doing, model their behaviors. But the thing that I've always said to everybody is that you've got to understand how they're thinking, because it's their attitude and their belief system by modeling their actions is going to have a significant impact on what they're doing. For the person that gets into flow because they decide that they want to get a jet skied out to the middle of the ocean and ride one of these big waves to get into flow state is not my idea of getting into flow state, which is what you're sort of essentially saying, is that everyone's got their own individual way of being able to get into it, and that's where the art piece comes.
I'm sorry, the art. Oh God, I lost the thread on the question. My bad. Now that I've said all that, right? The science of flow works for everybody. And the reason it's not called the science of the impossible is, while the science works for everybody, how you apply that science in your daily life, this is personality stuff. This is what works for me isn't going to work for you. I can't answer that question. To put it more specifically, you want more flow. You want more peak performance. You're going to want a bunch of things, but you definitely want more flow. Good luck. Good news. Flow states have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. There are 22 of them. They all work by driving attention into the present moment. Flow follows focus. It shows up when all of attention is right on the task at hand. That's what flow's triggers do. They drive attention into the now. We could put it formally. I could say they drive dopamine or norepinephrine into our system. These are performance enhancing, focus enhancing neurochemicals, or they lower cognitive load, which is all the crap you're thinking about at any one time. If I lower cognitive load, I free up energy, which the brain then spends on paying attention to the thing at hand. That's the neurobiology. That is the same in everyone. For example, novelty is a flow trigger. When we see something new, that activates the salience network. This is the same in everybody, right? And you're going to get dopamine, guaranteed. And you get enough of that dopamine, it's going to drop you into flow. This is why traveling is such a high flow activity. Everything's novel that's producing a lot of dopamine, and it helps drive you into flow. But which of flow's 22 triggers you're going to be most susceptible to, that's very individual. That's the art, right? The art of the impossible is the application of the science in your life on a day-to-day basis. I always say peak performance is nothing more or less than compound interest, right? It's a little bit today, a little bit tomorrow, a little bit the next day, but it's really week after week, month after month, year after year. That's when the results get truly magnificent. That part of it is a checklist, but like how you're going to do that in your own life, that's the art, I think. So that's why I called it the art of impossible. That was a long answer.
And I agree, and a fantastic answer, and I love it. And the one of the things that I think I've heard you say it many times, and I've read it in the books, coming back to the science and talking about the art, is that one of the many ways that you've identified that people get into flow state is when they're operating at about 4% above their skill level, I'm right in saying, on a particular activity. So can you talk a little bit more about what that 4% is, and is that generalized?
Yeah. That's very general. Yeah. So if you got to go back to the original, when I first talked about it in Rise of Superman, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the godfather of flow psychology, who did all the foundational psychological work in the 70s and the 80s, a bunch of years ago, sat down with a Google mathematician. And so, okay, let me back up. Flow's most important trigger, the trigger that people call it the golden rule of flow, is known as the challenge skills balance. The idea is we pay the most attention to what we're doing when the challenge of that task slightly exceeds our skill set. So you want to stretch but not snap, right? This is outside our comfort zone. So to do this work, you've got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, but not too far outside, because then you've got too much anxiety and it's going to block flow. So Csikszentmihalyi and this Google mathematician sat down and they were like, can we figure out, put a number on the difference between challenge and skills? Like, how much greater than your skills does the challenge actually have to be? That was the question. Now, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. We'll go down a different rabbit hole. I literally, like, Csikszentmihalyi told that story to a friend of mine who he was friends with, a mutual friend, and it sort of came back to me, and I went, "Oh, that's really cool. That's an interesting number, 4%. Let's test it. Let's try to test it." And so over about 4 or 5 years, we dreamed up all these crazy ways to sort of try to test it, but it's nearly impossible to do consistently over time. But what we found, surprisingly, is it's a deadly accurate metaphor. Like, it's right there. Like, it's hard to, is it 4%? Is it 5%? Is it 7%? Does it change every day a little bit? Yes, all those things are true. But what's cool about that number and what I like about it is it's so small. And the reason, here's the big deal. The big deal is 4% is still tough. If you're shy, if you're meek, if you're quiet, if you're timid, if you're not really like a gung-ho, hard-charging, risk-taking all the time person, you're still outside your comfort zone. You're going to be a little anxious. You're going to be nervous. You're going to be pushing on your skills to the utmost. It's going to be hard. For hard chargers, which is a lot of the people I end up dealing with, whatever the field they're in, 4%, 5%, whatever, is so small that they will blow past it 10 to take on challenges. Peter Diamandis, right? Challenges are 10%, 20%, 30%, 40% greater, just because like it's gonna pay attention, right? He wakes him up. And I'm not saying don't go after those are high, hard goals. Motivation science tells us that if you set a high, hard goal properly, you can get an 11 to 25% boost in motivation simply by a properly created higher hard goal. So you want those big, huge challenges, but the key is that to remember to chunk it down so that what you're doing right here, right now, paying attention to is just slightly outside your skill set. So that's the secret there. And that's why I like that number so much. Also because as people start to get more flow in their life, and they start getting better at performance, right? In the beginning, I think it's useful because it calms down the hard chargers and it lets the shy or meek or timid people know in advance, hey, you're going to be uncomfortable, but not too terribly uncomfortable. That's useful. Why it's super useful is once you start getting more flow in your life, you start getting better. And you start, and nothing is more addictive than progress. Progress is such an addictive drug, right? The dopamine that you get from mastery, from progress, is really, really significant. And so you just naturally, 4% is no longer enough. You want more and more, and I'm going to go farther and I'm going to work harder. And all that is great. That's motivation, but it doesn't change the fact that today you only get to be 4% better than you were yesterday. Like, that's the farthest you should push, because otherwise, so like, for example, I ski. I'm super passionate about skiing. When I'm looking at a jump and I'm like, okay, yesterday I was clearing, 25 feet, and this jump is 40, and it doesn't matter how good I feel or what my friends are doing. I know that's outside 4%. Like maybe I want to roll the dice, but what that 4% tells me is a pretty good chance I'm going to get so scared going off that thing that it's going to push me out of the challenge skills sweet spot. I won't be able to drop into flow. And thus, am I really ready to do a 40-foot drop, not being in flow? No. Okay. So if I'm not ready to do that, don't mess around with it. It keeps me, sort of within myself more.
Keeps you alive.
It keeps you alive. We also, here's the really cool thing. Here's for regular people that I think is really interesting. This was very true in athletics. We've been trying to do the studies outside of athletics. It seems to be true, but so you probably know this as an athlete. Usually when sort of you come into a season, you sort of like, there's a handful of days of, oh, fuck, this is uncomfortable. This is hard. And then suddenly like you're there, you're back, you get a bunch of flow. And then you tend to plateau for a long time. And then you start getting into more flow at the tail end of the season. That's really common. A lot of flow on the front end, very little in the middle, long plateau, bunch of up. And then if flow equates to accelerated learning, accelerated progress, right? You're stalling, right? What we found is when people stay in that 4% sweet spot, they don't plateau. They keep progressing. It's slower, right? It's slower than the big leaps that you can take by taking occasional big chances or pushing really hard, but it's steady. You don't seem to have these long plateaus. And measured over a season, over a year, over 2 years, over 3 years, you get so much farther.
Yeah, I think I can't remember the guy's name. You might know his name, but there was a big wave surfer who wanted to attempt the whatever height wave it was, but he was nervous and getting anxious and therefore not getting to flow. And he realized that there was a real risk that he could drown. So he went away and learned to hold his breath.
Yeah, this is Ian Walsh. This is in Rise of Superman. Ian Walsh. So this is one of those impossibles in action sports. Like surfing, there had been a law, iron law, 25 feet is the biggest wave any human can surf. No, you can't push above that, not possible. There were physics papers written about how it was impossible to paddle into a wave of 25 feet because the wave itself moves too fast for a dude on his belly windmilling around to catch. So psychologically, Laird Hamilton got past this barrier with toe-in surfing. So suddenly, in the 90s, people started to realize, oh wow, you can actually surf these waves. They're not going to kill you to stand on them and ride them, which was a total impossible. Nobody knew. But Ian started to realize that there were these little pockets on any giant wave where the wave, instead of being at like 70 feet, was dead vertical. And so he realized that if you could paddle yourself and position yourself to like one of these big pockets, you get a gravity assist. It would drop you into the wave and you might be able to paddle into these bigger waves. The problem, as you pointed out, is Ian couldn't hold his breath very long. Like he thought 40 seconds was the outset of what he could do. And big waves is like a 2 or 3 set hold down at a place like Jaws. You could be under for minutes. And so he lateralized. He went sideways. He couldn't get past the challenge skill sweet spot. So he went sideways into freehold breath diving. Went to a freehold breath diving clinic, learned how to, do basic breathing exercises, hold his breath for like 4 or 5 minutes underwater. And this was, this is basically like a 1-week freehold breath diving clinic. Almost anybody can learn to do this with proper breathing techniques. And then once he had it down and practiced for a while, he went back into big wave surfing. And now he knew he could handle the wipeouts. I'll give you another example of this. I decided this year at age 53, I was going to learn how to park ski, terrain park, flips, spins, jumps, which is supposed to be impossible by the way, for somebody my age, but I didn't think it was. And so I got very, very far. But one of the blocks that I've gotten to kind of at the end of my season was spinning over certain levels of height. Like I couldn't, it was so outside the challenge skill sweet spot for me. I couldn't get past it. So this summer, I've been spending a ton of time on trampoline parks. Why? Because I want my air sense. I want spinning at height over and over and over again, so that when I get back on skis, in December or whatever, that's not going to be an issue. I lateralized in some, and you could do this. We're giving physical examples from athletics, but the same is true. You can do the same thing with, mental problems and cognitive flow and things like that.
Absolutely. And I think that it is a really important example, because like you say, it becomes the stepping stone. It's the action, as I would put it. So I break down the difference between goals and actions. The action's the doing that creates the end goal, but the action can be at 4% that ultimately means the impossible goal, whatever that would be, actually gets achieved. You talk about a 4-stage cycle of flow. What's the 4 stages?
Yeah, so this is there was an old idea, and it wasn't really an idea. We thought flow was like a binary, like sort of like you're in the zone, you're out of the zone, you're awake, you're asleep, right? Like it worked like a light switch. And it turns out that's not the case at all. It's actually a 4-stage cycle. And there's huge changes in neurobiology under each stage of the cycle. So you don't get to live in a flow state. That's not possible, for the simple reason that you have to move through the complete cycle to reboot flow. On the front end, so before we can get into this, one thing I should tell you about flow is sort of what happens when you learn a whole bunch of different skills consciously. You work really hard and then they snap together. And you can suddenly execute all of them together unconsciously, right? Now, this could be, think about, I always say, it's probably the same swinging a cricket bat, but in baseball. There are 11 different micro skills involved in swinging a bat. You have to learn to keep your eye on the ball. You have to learn to keep the bat even. You have to learn to swing all the way through. You have to learn to step through your swing, shift your hip, blah, blah, blah. Usually we learn a couple at a time, you know what I mean? But often we have to practice for a long time. Okay, this is my keeping my eye on the ball, keeping my eye, right? And always what happens after we've learned all those skills individually and suddenly the brain puts them together and you're hitting home runs every time, right? That's what flow is. So on the front end of a flow state, we have a loading phase. You have to, this is where your skill acquisition, it's learning, right? It's knowledge acquisition. It's literally called the struggle phase. And it was named that by the neurobiology. This stuff was originally figured out by a Harvard cardiologist named Herbert Benson. And he nicknamed it struggle for a reason. It is frustrating. You literally have to overload working memory. Working memory is all the things you're trying to think about at once. You're going to overload it. In fact, you need to take the brain up to the edge of frustration. If you want maximum progress, you actually really have to almost work yourself, like your brain, to the point that it's about to explode. There are neurobiological reasons for it, but what this tells us a couple interesting things. Most of us grow up believing if you're frustrated, you're doing something wrong, right? Oh, I'm so goddamn frustrated. I can't get anywhere. I got to stop. I got to regroup. I'm done with this thing. And it turns out it actually is a necessary step in the process to get towards flow. The second stage in the cycle, now you've loaded your brain. Now you got to take your mind off the problem. You got to let it literally relax so your brain can take all this stuff it's trying to learn and pass it from conscious mind to the subconscious mind and start finding connections and links between it, which is what brains do automatically by themselves. You don't have to do anything. You just have to stop doing what you're doing. What works best, this is the release phase. It's the second stage in what's known as the flow cycle. Low-grade physical activity actually seems to work the best. You don't want to exhaust yourself. So this isn't go to the gym and go crazy hard, but this is a light workout. This is yoga. A long walk works for a lot of people, especially in nature, works really, really well. There's research that shows building model airplanes or jigsaw puzzles or just something that keeps you a little bit engaged, but not too much. Albert Einstein, famous example, he would sail. And this was when he was in Switzerland, and he would sail his sailboat into the middle of Lake Geneva. Couple of things worth knowing. One, Einstein couldn't swim and didn't really know how to sail. Two, Lake Geneva is prone to all kinds of freak storms. Einstein, this was so foundational to his process as to how he dropped into flow. He wouldn't stop doing it. And they kept having to rescue Einstein from the middle of Lake Geneva over and over and over again. It's a little known fact, but this is about the release phase. The third stage in the cycle is the flow state itself. Huge, enormous high, spike in peak performance. And on the back end of that, there's a recovery period. So flow is expensive for the body to produce. A high energy state burns a lot of calories, and what goes up must come down. And there's a recovery state on the back end of flow. And interestingly, recovery really here demands active recovery. So passive recovery, TV and a beer, not going to get it done on the back end of flow. You need restorative yoga. Kind of mindfulness practice works really well. Infrared saunas or saunas in general, massage, Epsom salt baths. Any of those things are active recovery protocols. Really, really important for flow. So that's the full stage of the flow cycle. That's sort of the map of the territory. I always say flow triggers are your toolkit, right? They tell you when I'm at this point in the map, this is what I should reach for to kind of drive myself forward. But you need both. You need to have some understanding of the triggers and some understanding of the territory.
The one that I thought, as you were saying that, when you're talking about the release, it made me think of the times when I go on holiday. So I'm pretty intense. I have 3 months where I'm just crazy, busy. And then I'll go away for 3 months. So in this winter season, I'll go skiing or I'll go and do something. And in the summer, I'll go on that downtime for holiday. And that's almost like the reason. And that's when I have some of the most creative ideas. And I'm wondering if that's maybe linked to it. So you got struggle, release. What was the third one?
Flow,
and then recovery. Right. Okay, cool. Great. So where I was thinking of going from here. So we've talked a lot about flow and how to get into it and where we're at. But one of the other interests and I suppose passions of yours, something you've done a lot of work on. Like I said, the likes of various different books, like the Future is Faster Than You Think, and obviously Peter Diamandis being a sort of a real tech enthusiast. I've been part of Abundance Digital and love those various movements. You've said a lot about the biology of flow state and operating at peak performance. You've got the likes of Neuralink, which Elon's been working on, and how those technical developments are going to be happening. How do you see the human development of flow merging with technology as the coming months and decades come into the future?
Yeah, so little context. One, I said, whenever you see the impossible become possible, you see flow, you see a bunch of other things. You really see two things. You see people figuring out how to extend human capability, and that's mostly flow. And then you see people harnessing disruptive technology. That's where the impossible, that's the intersection. So like half of my career was spent studying the disruptive technology side, half was spent studying the human capability, human performance side, but they come together that way. That was sort of the original interest there. Now it's interesting because I have at the Flow Research Collective, where we train 1,000 people a month in this stuff. We try, it's not to say that you can't use technology to harness flow, to help you drop into flow, or you can't use pharmacology for that matter. There is some stuff that works, but it doesn't seem to work for everyone. It seems to work for certain individuals. We haven't made it that way. And I always say, with peak performance, I want something that's reliable, repeatable, that works every time. And in crisis situations, I don't have time to deal with the technology. I don't have time to deal with the substance. I want like my psychology or my physiology, because it's right there with me and it's going to work every time. So that's how we think about it from training. That said, the entire research side of my company is probing the neurobiology of flow. Where we are getting better and better and better at the brain imaging technology. We've made tremendous progress in flow over the past 20 years. We've got a pretty good understanding of the neurobiological correlates of flow. We're starting to tease out the physiology. There appears your heart rate has a signature for flow. Heart rate variability may have a signature for flow proneness. There's some physiology stuff, like there's a face reading signature for flow. All that stuff is sort of being worked out. That's going to get better and better and better and better. And sooner or later, and we're doing a lot of this work, so hopefully it'll be sooner, we'll be able to put something that can measure, whether or not you're in flow into wearables, right? And then once that happens, we can then there's an app. Okay, this is what your wearables say. These are the steps you need to take to go into flow. It's probably going to be more than like, there's going to be personality profiles, and it's going to be thicker because everybody's going to be a little different. And in terms of the advice you're going to want to give, but that's where it's going. Where I think it's where I'm excited. Some of this stuff is that we've got really we're doing some work with Kelly Slater and their wave pool, because surfing is such a reliable trigger of flow. So now we're bringing our neuro lab to their wave pool, putting them together. Some of the really cutting edge, cool VR simulations that involve haptics and movement and things like that, really good at triggering flow. And so going to unlock all kinds of new avenues for research. What I'm interested in, where I think we're 5 to 10 years, to answer the final end of your question, what do I think we're going to? I can tell you where we're going at the Flow Research Collective, which is once we sort of can measure flow in you and trigger flow in you, we can then take that information. VR and AR seem to be very, very good at helping us trigger flow, very good at getting at flow triggers. Video games are okay, but AR, VR, really good. So I think we're going to end up with a AR/VR based high flow accelerated learning environment fairly soon. And the reason that matters, for one, the reason we're developing it is worker retraining. I think technological unemployment could be an issue. I am much more optimistic about that particular one than most people, but it doesn't change the fact that certain jobs, for example, in America, trucking is the largest blue collar employer in the country, right? It's 50% of all blue collar jobs is trucking. And we know that autonomous trucks they're here. Like Elon's got his new factory in Texas, he's building them. And truck obsolescence, because it's obviously there's turnover and things like that. But 2035, 2038, that job as a category does not exist in any way, shape, or form. Like, right. And all of those people need some kind of retraining, or they're, or we've got issues. And I come out of a blue collar world. You know what I mean? Let's retrain folks. But obviously the real excitement around these ideas is for education. That's not going to, I'll build the platform. I'm going to let somebody else wade into that particular one, because the minute you step into education, you're in a curriculum battle with parents and teachers unions, and I like somebody else's problem, not my problem. I don't want that fight.
So do you think what you just said there in regards to the whole, well, which is where we're going anyway, right? With regards to technology and having the impact in the way that it is. But do you think we'll be in a position in the future whereby, because flow is such a optimal state to be operating in, where we'll have the ability to literally turn it on at the flick of the switch, due to whether it's technology that tells us exactly what our way of getting into it is, or whether it's a form of the neurochemicals that we can take as a tablet that gets us into it? Do you think it'll be that'll be the case?
I don't know. And the reason I don't know is, so for example, the work that I've been involved in for the past couple of years has really been looking at the neural dynamics of flow state onset. So what is going on the network level of the brain during the first 2 seconds of flow, during state onset? It is a significant shift in neurobiological function, changes in brain waves and neural and whole networks and things like that. I'm not saying we're not going to get to that point sometime, but I don't see it happening immediately, because there's just so much going on. And that's, what we know now. And with we know enough to be dangerous. We know enough to train it. And you got to understand how far we've come. Back in the 90s, when we were trying to train flow with psychology, like, you can read this, Flow in Sports, written by Susan Jackson and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Is Susan Jackson, this like Olympic level sports psychologist coach, and Csikszentmihalyi trying to train people with flow, and they're bad. Like, the results are crap. And everybody in the field was like, oh, wow, the results are really crap with this. At the Flow Research Collective, we train about 1,000 people a month. We measure flow pre and post with the exact same instruments that Csikszentmihalyi and Susan Jackson measured with. And we see a 70 to 80% increase in flow. It's that reliable, that repeatable. So can we do it on demand, which is what you're asking? Possibly. We could get closer on demand, maybe a lot closer, but I still don't think it's a light switch. I think it's going to be a little bit more than that. And let me give you one example. This is coming out of the neural dynamics of flow. So that struggle phase, usually people think about that in terms of like, oh, okay, I'm going to write a book. So the struggle phase is I'm doing all my research. I'm interviewing hundreds of people and I'm taking a blah, blah, right? That's a long drawn out struggle phase. We also see it like in very small swatches. So it seems like you need to trigger the fight response, even if it's only for a second, to generate the testosterone at the front end to drive that focus. Now, is this true for everybody? We don't yet know, but like that struggle phase, true. And then a bunch of other, right? So there's just such a complicated cascade, and I don't know. I'm going on and on about science things and this or that, and the answer is I don't know. And the truth of the matter is I don't care. I know that's weird. I want to make it reliable and repeatable and trainable, and I want to know how it works, right? Yeah. And all those things are moving along steadily. Flow in a pill, sort of the lazy person's approach to peak performance, which is what that really is, that has never worked. There are no shortcuts in peak performance. There's no 3 things to do Monday morning. And so I think the thinking and the craving that sort of like leads that question seems to come with, that's what I think. I think that's dangerous to peak performance. I think it's a bad way to think about this stuff. I think it's another way of saying, oh, I'd like the easy way out. I'd like peak performance, but I don't want to work very hard. And that's not what this science shows, right? You can perform so much better than you possibly can imagine, but you're going to have to work really hard to do it.
Yeah, and that's what most people don't want to hear, right? It's the irony of it. Two final things to look at finishing up on. One, I completely forgot to say to you, I need to thank you. Well, in one of your books, again, I forget what one it was. You introduced the word that I'd never heard at the time. I'd heard a variation of it, and you know what the variation is. Was ecstasis, and yeah, and I ended up calling one of my companies Ecstasis purely because of the meaning of what it meant, which is so yeah, thank you for that. But there's a question that you ask people on your podcast, which is I'm going to paraphrase slightly here, but if you could have the research from like 30 years from now,
the research genie question.
Yeah. So if you could have that research, like if the research genie you could rub Aladdin's lamp and he'd go, there you go, Steven, you've got the research that you want right now to make the impact that you want to have in your life. Or maybe it's just out of curiosity that you want to know for yourself. What would that research be that you would have?
For me, it's never changed, right? I want to understand the neurobiology of flow, like down, to the ion channel level and up to the whole brain level. That's always what I wanted. I don't like the research genie question because I want to do that work.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? I would like to have that. I would like to have the answer before I die, very, very much. But the research genie, I might spend it on something like, right, where does consciousness come from? It'd be hard not to like, if you're giving me the research genie thing, like what happened before the Big Bang? Where does consciousness come from? Those are the questions I might have to start poking at.
Yeah. Sounds great. Well, look, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a fantastic episode. I absolutely loved it. For people that this has intrigued them, where can people find you? Where can people go and learn more?
For sure.
And connect?
flowresearchcollective.com. It's the Flow Research Collective. In fact, gift for your listeners, we built a free diagnostic on, there are 6 major flow blockers. You want more flow in your life? So there's 6 things that tend to stand between us and more flow. And we built a diagnostic, www.flowblocker.com. And it's free to take. It won't take that long. You'll get a detailed like next action steps response. It's pretty thick. It's worth a damn. That you guys can have that if you want that. Flowresearchcollective.com. There's tons of free videos, tons of free information there. If you want more about me, stevenkotler.com. Apparently I'm on social media. I've heard rumors. I don't know if they're true or not, but I've heard rumors.
Fantastic. All right. Well, look, what we'll do is we'll put those links in the show notes so everyone can just easy access, head to the show notes now and go and get those. Steven, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much. It's been a really enjoyable conversation. And for everyone that's been listening, until next time, make it happen.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Make It Happen with Will Polston podcast. Make sure you join Will's free Facebook group, the Make It Happen community. Please support the show by subscribing on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or Google Play. Share this episode with at least one friend you think would benefit from it, and give Will a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts. Until next time, make it happen.